Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Issues and Answers, Education and the Culture Wars. I'm Anthony Moreno. On this program, we will learn more about proposed revisions to New Mexico's social studies standards. We will have a discussion on critical race theory and ethnic studies, and we will also feature a panel discussion to learn more about how rhetoric in politics and the media around race and social justice may impact education. We start off with learning more about the state of New Mexico announcing that the Public Education Department will be revising new social studies standards for K-12 students. Here to share more about this is New Mexico Lieutenant Governor Howie Morales, who recently wrote an opinion piece addressing the rhetoric surrounding these changes and proposals. Lieutenant Governor Morales is a former state senator and educator in Grant County schools. He also has a PhD in curriculum and instruction from New Mexico State University. Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us.
Anthony, it's always a good opportunity to visit with you, to be on the air, and especially tackling some of the important issues that are surrounding our state today. So thank you for the invitation.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. I want to start off with why. Why now do social studies standards in New Mexico need to be revised?
Now, this is a process that's nothing new to curriculum updates throughout our history. We did that most recently in 2017 with our science standards under a different governor, a different public education department. And this is a similar process that's taking place now with updating our social studies standards. We have to keep in mind that those standards haven't been updated in 20 years. That was in a time where there's been a lot of changes that have occurred. And it's important that we give students every opportunity to have the current up-to-date events so they can be discussed, dialogued, debated, and ultimately critical thinking opportunities.
Okay, so what are some of the main things that are going to be implemented with these changes? What are folks going to see with this proposal?
Yeah, so we're going to see some updated historical events that are taking place from a time of 9/11 and what happened right there. You're going to see some other discussions that'll take place. We landed when NASA landed on Mars with the rover. We've seen that that's taken place. We went through a Great Recession. We've seen that there's been the capture of bin Laden. Many of these occurrences that have happened are going to be part of the curriculum. One thing that I always like to share is that you have a person who has a child who's in kindergarten. That kindergartner today is still getting the same curriculum as the parent who was there 20 years ago. So I think that kind of puts it in context, the need for wanting to do that. But there'll be a lot of discussion, a lot of opportunities in these proposed standards to also include. And I think that's a key component, is that we're not subtracting anything from these social studies standards. We're adding to cultural opportunities to see some of the updated events. These type of things that I think are so important, especially for a diverse state like us in New Mexico.
Okay, I certainly want to talk about that a little bit more, but I know a major component of these revisions is going to be civics, getting a stronger education in civics with students, even at a younger age. Can you address this?
Yeah, and I want to make sure and let the audience know, as a past educator who's been in the classroom, I did teach social study classes, and more so as I'm a parent. I want to make sure that as we can talk about opportunities for engagement for students, that it impacts me just as much as anyone else. And when we're talking about civic engagement, I think that is an important component to have our students understand the importance of being actively involved in civics and community, and to make sure that it's utilized as a positive, whether it's learning how to beautify your community, whether it's learning about the process of voting and the importance of voting, especially during a time where we see that there's a lot of questions around voting. Great opportunity for our students from elementary all the way to high school to learn about the civic engagement opportunities that exist every day around us.
Some of the critics of these proposals have said that when you mention civics, that means encouraging political action or for students to take certain political action. That has some people concerned. Can you address that?
Yeah, so the term, politics is really engaging in your community, engaging in civic opportunities. Doesn't necessarily mean what you're seeing as being promoted. In many ways is fear that we're trying to create protesters, we're trying to create engagement that isn't positive. It's just the opposite. We want to make sure that our students are fully understanding the world around them and having the opportunity to know that they can make a significant difference in whatever areas that they're so inclined to do and to undertake. Again, civic engagement is a positive and in no way should be interpreted as a way of making any negative approaches to that.
Okay, you wrote in your opinion piece that around 500 people have weighed in on the proposed changes to New Mexico's social studies revisions, and one thing that did stand out was fear. Can you give us an idea of what you mean by that?
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to be available, to be accessible to the public, because as I stated, coming as an educator and as a parent, this takes place, and I understand we're coming out of a pandemic in many ways where parents had to become the homeschool teachers, and our educators did the best they could to educate them in a remote way. So there's a lot more interest and engagement within the educational journey of our kids. I want to point out that at the end of the day, what we all want is we want a good curriculum. We want a solid education for all of our children, and that's important that that is done. But when we're talking about some of the concerns that are out there, I wanted to share some calming approaches of why this is something that's important. It's nothing new, like I stated, that we did in 2017 with the science standards, and it is improvement to our curriculum, to our standards, and still giving the flexibility to that professional in the classroom to develop the lesson plans, to use their creativity in ways to engage students and to discuss all these important issues.
Now, you write that some in our state have fallen victim to the noise and falsehoods. Can you share a little bit more about what you mean by that and how you think misinformation may possibly be surrounding these proposals of social studies revisions?
Yeah, it comes at a time within our whole country that we see that there's a lot of opinions about a lot of issues. And I think that some of the terms that have been thrown out there have really been put out there to create some fear that we're going to try to indoctrinate students, that we're going to try to do things that it's going to be not in the positive light that we should. But the reality of it is, what we're doing by adding that is that we're creating an opportunity for students to see themselves in the curriculum, to have an opportunity to see those that went before them that are from the same communities, the same cultures, and what they've done within history. So I think that that is key. And when parents are concerned, and I want to stress the fact that that's why it's so important that such a hearing session takes place, that's beyond a hearing session on Friday at noon. It's a listening session for those to be voiced, those concerns to be shared, and then for the opportunities to further improve the proposed standards.
Republicans in New Mexico's House of Representatives have voiced strong concern and opposition about the proposed new standards. They sent a letter to the Public Education Department expressing strong opposition, saying these changes, quote, incorporate the fundamentally flawed concepts of critical race theory, plus impose a progressive liberal bias in regards to historical and societal events that are being mandated to be taught in New Mexico students. Will these new standards include critical race theory?
Yeah, and that's a term that I don't use because it absolutely not is incorporated in our social study proposed standards. That's a term that's been thrown around and really a lot of misinformation with that. The reality of it is that we're updating the standards, that we're including relevant occurrences that have happened over the last 20 years and doing it in a way that is going to be a celebration of who we are, of our cultures, of our diversity, or our ethnicity, and providing that student the opportunity to engage in healthy discussion, to get all of the story told, and to make sure that they can make the determination of what they feel is truth.
Well, I'd like to get more of your thoughts about what House Republican members had to say in this letter. They go on to say, quote, our country's history is not perfect in terms of economic and human rights, but that does not require altering social studies curriculums to embrace a highly distorted view that the U.S. is dominated by white supremacists and racists, end quote. Your thoughts on these words by GOP members of New Mexico's House?
You know, I sat in the legislature and I have tremendous respect for all 112 members of the legislative body. And, you know, as similar discussions that happened in 2017 with the science standards, these are brought forward now. You know, but I do have to say that when you look and see what it is that the fear is out there, it's based a lot off of what could happen or some hypothesis of what may happen. The reality of it is what we're doing is we're updating these standards. So I think it's important to recognize that we've been through this before. We'll continue to move forward with this and to recognize that it's not about fear. It's about opportunities for our students to have a curriculum that's engaging, that's inclusive, and above all is going to prepare them for real world settings on how to critically think for themselves.
Now, cultural studies has sort of been an issue in some recent elections. In the high profile governor's race in Virginia, newly elected governor of that state, Glenn Youngkin, mentioned banning critical race theories theory being taught in schools in many campaign stops. I'd like to hear from you your thoughts about the culture wars impacting education, not only in our state, but across the country. We've seen what's happened in the governor's race in Virginia. Former President Donald Trump has criticized ethnic or cultural studies many times. Over 20 states have tried to implement laws banning so-called critical race theory and cultural studies being taught in schools. So what are your thoughts on what's really happening right now with the national dialogue, and are you concerned about how that may impact education?
I'm always concerned on what may impact education. That's why I'm here today. And fortunately, with the people across the state of New Mexico support as a lieutenant governor, and specifically able to talk not only in the state, but nationwide on education and curriculum building. And so I think when you look and see some of the concerns that are out there, again, there is no critical race theory components within our standards. I think that is even a definition that people generally have a hard time being able to define. I do assure the public that what we have in our standards is addition for a well-rounded, rich curriculum, not in any way that would go in and create victims versus oppressors, but to have dialogue and discussions on what actually took place in our history and what can we do moving forward not to repeat the same things that could have taken place. I love the country. Those that maybe are in support or in opposition to this, they love our country. And again, keeping in mind that what we want for our students is a well-rounded education with every opportunity to engage. That's what these standards will set forth to do.
Okay, there's been a lot of talk and reporting about the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit facing New Mexico. How do you feel that these proposed standards can truly make a difference in educating all students in our state?
It ties exactly into what we've all known for years, that the state hadn't been doing as good a job as we should have been doing all along. And that's providing service to our underserved populations. When we see that our Native American communities, our colonias communities, that definitely need more resources, we also want to recognize that we recognize their contributions and their ancestors' contributions to our country and what that means. And that's what these standards will do. So it only aids the state's effort to meet the requirements of Yazzie Martinez, but beyond the requirements, that we're doing what we need to do for every single student that we value so much in this state.
Okay, so we're at a time right now where New Mexico is facing a teacher shortage, especially when it comes to substitute teachers in our state. The state is asking a lot from teachers these days. Some are even having to monitor other classrooms during their planning period. So how do you implement training at a time when New Mexico teachers are really stretched thin?
And I really appreciate you, Anthony, mentioning that, because that is probably one of the things that weighs on me the most as the biggest crisis that we have within our state and within our country. While there's been side discussions and a lot of emotion dealing with the new social studies standards, I want to keep in mind is the impact that's going to take place without those professionals in the classroom. So it's a huge concern of mine. And that great point that you raised, how do we train them? I think in working with our universities, making sure that we do that, not necessarily when they get on the job, even though that's ongoing, but they have that training as they go through their educational coursework and doing stuff like that. So it's a great opportunity, again, I would hope that it would encourage more educators from diverse backgrounds to want to go into the field because we can celebrate the contributions that they and others have given within our history.
Okay, now this is also happening during the time of a pandemic. So does the state have a plan to, should the pandemic get worse, and the state has to adapt to that and potentially go back to remote learning? We've already seen in parts of our region of New Mexico, in your county, Grant County, that county has seen one of the highest spikes in new COVID-19 infections, not only in the state, but in the country. So does the state have a plan for if the pandemic gets worse? And how are they going to adapt and train teachers if the pandemic does get worse?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's something that, weighs very heavily. A sigh of relief when the 5 to 11-year-old vaccine has been made available, knowing that those that get the vaccine are going to be safe from severe illness, hospitalization, and death. So I think that's a big shift as well. But we do see the numbers continually rising. The plan that I want is to make sure our kids stay in school. The problem where schools have had to close is because of staff members not being able to be covered because having to be out because of COVID, having to be out because of close contact. The key is to make sure that we can have as many people vaccinated as possible. Regardless of political beliefs, that is the way out of this pandemic. And I want to make sure that we can stress that. As far as a plan in place, again, is keeping kids in school is absolutely key. Obviously, we went through it for a year and a half of having to know how to navigate virtually. That is a plan that some schools have done already, and if we need to, we move forward. But I'm not advocating for that. What I'm advocating for is proactive approaches for vaccination, wearing the mask, keeping socially distant, and especially keeping our kids in school.
Lieutenant Governor Howie Morales, I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
School districts across the country have been facing many questions about critical race theory and cultural studies being taught in schools. Here to help us understand more about these issues is Dr. Dulcinea Lara. Dr. Lara has a background in researching cultural studies and critical race studies and is founder of the Borderlands and Ethnic Studies Certificate Program at NMSU and is also an associate professor in the Criminal Justice Department at the university. Dr. Lara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anthony.
I want to start off with critical race theory. We've heard so much about it. Can you kind of share with us what exactly is critical race theory? Give us an official definition, and also let us know what it is not.
Sure. So critical race theory has become a buzzword. It is a field of inquiry analysis tool that came from the legal realm, whereby in order to explain social issues, social phenomena, the idea with critical race theory is to look at the historical, legal, political, and social contexts that surround that social issue. So, for example, looking at a history of how race relations have been shaped over time through political, economic moments, through war, through colonization, through slavery, through all these moments that have affected certain populations in the United States. Critical race theory says this is how to explain the current social situation by looking at all those policies and legal actions that have happened in the past to bring us to this present moment. So critical race theory is being sort of misused by all kinds of people in media, in public discourse, as this scary thing, as something that we don't want in the schools.
Okay.
But it's
So let's talk about that. Can you kind of share with us how did critical race theory go from being discussed in law schools and in legal environments of study in higher education to campaign speeches?
I think it's a convenient, scary phrase for some people. I think the idea of talking about race, of unpacking racism and how it manifests in daily life is nerve-wracking for some people, and so you really saw this as part of the political campaign cycles last year, where people were riling up a base that was concerned about having more representation in politics, in education, in all social facets. So it kind of became this boogeyman, and people who didn't really know about critical race theory were defining it and making people very concerned that this was now going to trickle into the K through 12 curriculum.
So for those who may be concerned about critical race theory being discussed, not only in schools, but across our country in many different environments, what do you have to say to those folks about learning about it, and why is it important?
It's important because it allows us a way to understand social inequities without relying on historical stereotypes, right? So critical race theory helps us understand, for example, high dropout rates from schools. It helps us understand poverty in a more contextual way, rather than just kind of making assumptions that certain people aren't intelligent enough. For example, dropout rates of Hispanic, Native American, African American students are disproportionately higher than white students and Asian students. If we don't have something like critical race theory, we simply assume that there's certain groups that in essence are more intelligent, and certain groups that in essence are less capable, less intelligent. And so critical race theory basically just does away with stereotypes and stereotypical explanations for social inequities. That's what it does. And I think at the heart of that, people are scared to have a real historical and contextual explanation that would make us change the way we order and structure society.
From the definition you're giving us, I mean, it sounds like we could use critical race theory in many things that are being discussed today. I think of housing, I think of economics. Can you kind of give us an understanding of how that is possible?
Absolutely. So if you look at communities that have racial segregation, which most communities do, we have this kind of assumption that the majority of people in a poor neighborhood are people of color, just because that's the way it's always been, or they're not as hardworking, or they're not as employable, they're not as invested in their education. We have all these assumptions that we make and place those on people of color, groups that are underrepresented. But with critical race theory, you can literally look at the map of a community and start to understand the ways that that community historically was segregated. Even here in Las Cruces or in Albuquerque, different New Mexico cities, you can look at the historical makeup, the trajectory of how communities came together, and you can see where the resources are placed on certain neighborhoods and where the resources are denied. If you look at which streets get paved right away, which the trash routes, if you look at the rates of participation, civic engagement in city politics, you can start to see these disproportionate racial breakdowns. And what critical race theory basically says is, how do we understand that in a long-term sense to perhaps we don't have the same racial tension or segregation that we did in 1940 or in the 1800s, but those legacies have kept going in just more subtle, systematic ways. So critical race theory says that even though we don't have the same racial picture from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, those impulses have maintained through the ways we think about each other. And so, so even though it started as a legal picture, it includes the historical context by which these racial groups have been divided and disproportionately advantaged or disadvantaged.
As we have this conversation, states across the country, the legislatures in many states are addressing this with bills that actually ban critical race theory from being taught in schools. Texas signed a bill recently, the governor there signed a bill recently banning critical race theory from being taught in schools. When you see things like this happen, what comes to mind?
People are scared of an equitable redistribution of wealth. So we're kind of careful not to talk about how this conversation really has its roots in power. Who has power in a community? Who is disempowered? Who has voice? Who does not have voice? So it's not surprising to me that school districts and entire education departments in states are banning critical race theory. What they don't know is that educators are teaching from a critical race theory perspective all the time, whether they call it that or not. It's basically just providing an equitable critical education to your students that looks at the histories of various peoples, that looks at the languages, the contributions. So we have kindergarten teachers in Las Cruces who are teaching critical race theory, if you want to say that without that label on top of it. So I think the label becomes this really contentious issue, but what's at the heart of critical race theory is equity. And if we understand the trajectories by which we arrived at 2021 with these ideas about race, then we can create better solutions. We can actually build a democracy that's representative of all people. So the people who are voting against critical race theory would prefer to rely on these antiquated stereotypical ideas of what different groups are capable of, what they're worthy of, etc. And they would rather not have the political landscape shift. So that's really what's going on there.
Okay, so we're having this big conversation across the country in many places on race and this issue in general. Now, with the population of the U.S. becoming more diverse, what are your concerns about how we have these conversations?
I think we lack tools. I am a proud New Mexico high school graduate from Southern New Mexico. And it took me leaving New Mexico to get an education in ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Native studies, in other states out of New Mexico. And it really is quite soothing and it's quite a relief to have the tools to be able to talk from an informed place about the historical legacies that have led us to this place. So in order to have these hard conversations, and I have compassion for everyone who is nervous about these conversations, we need tools, we need a shared language, we need to understand that there are various logics, various frameworks. We need to understand that a meritocracy is one type of viewing of society. There's humanitarian ways of looking at things. When we talk about being anti-racist, that makes some people nervous. But really, it's one way of walking in the world and acknowledging that these divisions between people have been constructed over time. They're not essential about all Mexican Americans, all African Americans, all Native Americans, right? All of us have a diversity of thought, a diversity of approaches to doing things. So I think as we get more diverse, like you said, Anthony, it behooves us as a society to strengthen the skill sets and diversify the skill sets of all of our young people. So sometimes I think adults are a lost cause, but my college students are so eager to learn this, and many of them are graduate students before they take my classes and ask, why didn't I have these tools from kindergarten on? So what's happening in most states, including New Mexico, is the question of how do we prepare our educators, how do we create new content and materials that reflects many different perspectives rather than sort of one dominant perspective.
As we have this conversation, the state of New Mexico is proposing new revisions to social studies for K through 12 students. I'd like to hear from you. How do you see these revisions impacting the education of students in New Mexico?
Great question. I'm actually on the advisory committee for that's doing those changes, and there's been teachers across New Mexico, administrators across the state of New Mexico, the public ed department. This has been a huge, widespread concerted effort of a collective of people in the education world who are looking at the standards and looking for the gaps, looking for the silences, looking for where it's strong, for where it could be strengthened. And so this new set of standards really offers educators a chance to get more equitable and diverse in the ways that they teach New Mexico history, US history, world history, economics, geography. There's even an ethnic studies strand in those new standards. So it's really about broadening. And I think part of the fear that I've seen from the educators that I work with is, okay, we like the concept. How do we get there? How do we get prepared for that? Because we ourselves didn't receive that education. So I think that the road is long ahead of us, but there needs to be that political will and the community will to say, let's give this a try, because we've been trying this other system for 150 years and it's very lopsided. And now in 2021, the argument I keep making is we have the tools, we have the knowledge, and we have the expertise. So why would we deny our New Mexico youth a fuller picture of the history of our state, our country, and our world when we have the knowledge to offer that?
The state of New Mexico is working to address the ruling in the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit the state is facing to improve education for all students in New Mexico, especially low-income Native American and English language learners, as well as students with disabilities. How do you see these new standards playing a role in addressing that lawsuit?
The lawsuit itself, great question, was ruled on in 2018. So we are 3 years out from that ruling. And I think because it's such a huge question, and because those four groups that you mentioned, Anthony, have been underserved for so long, there's many different pockets of activity to figure out how do we address this? How do we comprehensively make a plan that ensures that the educational offerings and treatment of all of our New Mexico students is equitable? So I see some advancement in some school districts, less in others. The New Mexico Public Education Department is really firmly behind that ruling and working to figure out how to implement that. And I just like to remind people that we're 500 years into a knowledge structure that hasn't changed too much. So it's going to take some time. And as I mentioned earlier, it will take that extra concerted effort to make, we're essentially creating something new. So people who are defending the current situation with education, that's something that already exists. What activists and educators and advocates are trying to do is to create a new curriculum, a new way of teaching altogether. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
Locally in Las Cruces, you've worked with the school district to implement an equity policy. You were on the committee as well, working on that. Were there some tough conversations on that committee when you were implementing this?
Yes, so the JBC equity policy was passed unanimously in May. And as you mentioned, it was very contentious. Those were some of the more fully attended school board meetings that I've been to in my years here in Las Cruces. And it was fairly split. There was a large group of people opposed to the equity policy, and there was a large group that came out to support. So like I mentioned, in May, it was voted and passed. And some of the ideas that I mentioned earlier were present in those debates. We don't want school to change, it's just fine. One of the big critiques of ethnic studies and critical race theory is that it fosters ethnic and racial division, which is not the case. I teach ethnic studies, and it's quite the opposite. So it was a tough time, I think, for Las Crucens, and it became very politicized. We saw some of that in the elections or the the elections for school board and city council. So it's become a very politicized issue as well.
Okay, we just have over a minute left for this conversation, but I want to ask you, you founded the Borderlands and Ethnic Studies Certificate Program at New Mexico State University. Why did you see the need for that program at the higher education level?
I don't know if you remember, Anthony, but we had a conversation 10 years ago, and there was a lot going on in Tucson, Arizona with banning Mexican American studies. And we had speakers come to NMSU to talk about their challenge with that. And I asked one of the main speakers, how do we help you? How do we at NMSU join the movement to help Tucson? And he pointedly said, build an ethnic studies program in Las Cruces first, and then we can just share that way of teaching, that way of knowing. So that's what we're trying to do here. We have a lot of community support and a lot of support internally at NMSU. So we're looking forward to that.
Dr. Dulcinea Lara is an associate professor at New Mexico State University in the Criminal Justice Department and is founder of the Borderlands and Ethnic Studies Certificate Program at NMSU. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anthony.
We now close the program with a panel discussion to learn more about how rhetoric in politics and the media on race and social justice may be impacting education. Joining us for this talk is Dr. Nancy Lopez, a professor in sociology at the University of New Mexico and director and co-founder for the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice at the university. Dr. Lopez is also the Associate Vice President for the Division for Equity and Inclusion at UNM. And we are also joined by Dr. Roberto Lozano, Assistant Superintendent of Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice at Las Cruces Public Schools. I want to thank you both for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for inviting.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Dr. Lopez, I would like to start with you. We've heard so much in the media and from politicians about ethnic studies, and I'd like to hear from you, how can ethnic studies reduce inequalities in education? What does the research show us?
Saludos familia, greetings family, and thank you, Anthony, for this wonderful opportunity to talk to you about how we can cultivate healthy and loving communities. The research evidence is clear. The content and lifelong learning skills learned in ethnic studies courses contribute to student success. A recent study published in the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences by my colleagues, Bonilla, Dee, and Penner, who did research on this topic on the impact of 9th grade ethnic studies high school classes, find that it reduced inequalities in academic outcomes as well as socio-emotional outcomes, and that these reductions in inequality were enduring. They lasted for a very long time. Many, many other studies show the same impact. So why would it be that critical reflection on our history, on culture, on power, whether in an ethnic studies course or a social studies course, a statistics course, or any other course, lead to lifelong enduring reductions in inequality? Why would reflection on identity, history, and culture, and the genealogy of the struggle for human rights lead to enhanced outcomes? Think about it. How could it be that cultivating that cultural wealth that exists in our communities for multiple generations can create unity? These skills are essential and relevant, not only for students that have historically suffered inequities, but for everyone, whether you are planning a career as an artist, a cultural worker, an engineer, a healthcare provider, or a teacher.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lopez. I'd like to talk with you, Dr. Lozano. Can you follow up on that? What are we seeing on the ground in the school district when ethnic studies or cultural studies are implemented into the classroom?
Yeah, so Anthony, thank you again for having me here today. And Dr. Lopez, thank you for that opening. And I concur with Dr. Lopez in her statements regarding ethnic studies. So in Las Cruces, we're in a very unique space because we are so culturally rich, just like any other community in the US. We work very closely with New Mexico State University. to implement ethnic studies. Dr. Dulcinea Lara from NMSU has partnered with us for the last, I believe, 3 or 4 years. In 2017, the School Board of Education signed a proclamation basically committing to supporting ethnic studies here in our school district. So what is happening now? We have a cohort of teachers who have gone through an intensive program through NMSU to really learn about what ethnic studies is and what it looks like in the classroom. Because at the end of the day, our job as a public education entity is to, of course, educate our students, reading, writing, math, all the standards that are out there, right? And what our jobs as educators is to do is how do we engage our students? How do we make them feel connected? LCPS has a population of over 75% who identify as Latino/Hispanic. So how do we make sure that our students and everything that they are learning, how do we make sure that they are connecting with that content? And really that's what it's about. And that's what ethnic studies here in Las Cruces Public Schools is, right? Is making sure that not only just in social studies, but in every content area that we find ways to engage our students so that they could better connect with what they're learning. And what better way than to engage them through our local history, through understanding some of the topics. Some may be harder than others for teachers to present, but really making sure that we give them that lens and make students become critical thinkers. So again, really excited that we have that partnership with New Mexico State University and looking forward to expanding on that.
Dr. Lopez, there may be some folks who, when they hear about ethnic studies being taught in schools, they may think that, just focus on ethnicity, culture, and race. But what does the research show when these courses are implemented in K through 12 education? How does it affect a student beyond the classroom?
That's such an important question. So in a study that I co-authored and published in the Race, Ethnicity, and Education Journal, we look at the odds of graduating over a 9-year period in a large public university in the Southwest, and we find that low-income white and Asian women are 14% less likely to graduate college than high-income white women. The numbers for low-income Hispanic women were 23% less likely, and for Black women, it was 19%. For American Indian women, it was 40% less likely to graduate. So how could it be that among low-income women of all of low-income backgrounds, the range was from 14 to 40%? It should be clear that reporting odds of graduating by gender, income, or race alone is insufficient. Look at our COVID-19 pandemic. A recent study by Feldman and Bassett published in the Journal of the American Medical Association found that while it's true that men in general die more often of COVID than women, the cumulative mortality was lower for white men than for women who are Black, Indigenous, Alaska Native, Latina, or Pacifica. So again, an intersectional lens would help us understand that in order to understand this other paradox, that for white men with a high school degree or less, the rate of mortality was the same as for college educated Black, American Indian, and Latino men. So again, these courses allow us to reflect on the historical circumstances that formed the backdrop for these complex inequalities as a first step for creating unity and understanding and creating solutions. It helps us to think together creatively about the kind of future we want to create and how we can address these problems that will really impact the future of our country.
Dr. Lozano, Dr. Lopez talked about some statistics there in inequalities. Are you concerned about the inequalities that Dr. Lopez brought up, about how they may be happening in your school district and how the pandemic may be playing a role in possibly making those inequalities worse?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's a great point that Dr. Lopez brings up. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, one of the key findings that we've realized, right, was we knew that a lot of our students, unfortunately here in Doña Ana County, lived in poverty. But with the pandemic, just really highlighted the areas of growth that we have really here in our county, but really as a state as well. Access to internet, access to a computer. We've really come a long way from the beginning of the pandemic till now, and to making sure that each one of our LCPS students has access to that. However, one of the things that I know was a challenge during the middle of the pandemic when schools were when we were remote learning was students having access to a parent at home, right? Because they were working, they didn't have that support at home. So just like I think any other district around the nation, and I'll go say around the world, right? We really saw the inequities within certain populations that were really highlighted during the pandemic. So aligned with everybody else across the nation, it was no different here in Las Cruces as well.
A follow-up question to that. During this pandemic, you mentioned that there wasn't a parent at home. Now, thinking about these inequalities that we've talked about so far, there's obviously a digital divide in New Mexico. Do you see any parallels with those two issues in your school district, Dr. Lozano?
No, absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier, so a lot of the times it was the older brother, high school. Most of the times it was an older sibling that was staying at home with the first, second grader, right? Trying to really instruct them, right? In collaboration with the teacher. But the parallel was there. And unfortunately, the common denominator was their socioeconomic stability during that time. Fortunately, most of the parents were working at jobs that required for them to be there. Low paying wages equated to students more than likely not having access, not only to that support, that parent support during that time, but also internet not working appropriately. We really, like I said, tried really hard to provide access to them, but sometimes even in our outskirts of the city, in the county lines, there were times where hotspots weren't working, or any internet provider. So obviously that is an area that we are still struggling with, but I think we've come a long way and found other solutions to make sure that if we were ever to be in the situation that we were a year and a half ago, that we would be a lot more prepared.
Okay. Dr. Lopez, I'd like to hear more about how ethnic studies and cultural studies can make an impact on a student's emotional well-being. Research has shown that New Mexico has some of the highest rates of children suffering from adverse childhood experiences. How can ethnic studies or the use of critical race theory play a role and help address this issue?
That's such a great question. So like I said, the previous researchers found in a number of districts that it not only enhances academic outcomes, but socio-emotional well-being and mental health, et cetera. And I just want to share a quick poem, first in Spanish and then in English, that's often used in a lot of ethnic studies courses that I think might be part of how we see these reductions in inequality. It's called En la Quech.
Okay, I don't want to interrupt the poem, but if you could just do maybe in English, since we only have about 8 minutes left.
No problem. Yeah, it's very short. It's literally 3 lines.
Okay.
En la Quech, I am you, you are me. You are my other me. If I do harm to you, I do harm to myself. If I love and respect you, I love and respect myself. So again, thinking about how it is creating this community where people are anchored in their identities, but at the same time shifting and understanding those that are different from them, and creating this sense of commitment to humanity and interdependence and love obviously has an effect on students' mental health, well-being, sense of trust and community, and love for one another, love for humanity. So when we think about who's best positioned to understand what are the community needs of youth, what are the systems that need to change in order to create healthy communities, how can youth from different backgrounds describe their physical and mental health needs? These are the kinds of questions that are often addressed in these classes, along with other classes that engage in centering the needs of youth. And how could that, again, contribute to reductions in mental and physical health inequities that we've seen in communities for so many generations?
So, Dr. Lopez, I mean, critical race theory, which you've researched extensively, it has really become a buzzword for politicians and for national media figures. There's been a lot of disagreement and misinformation around it as well. Through your research that you've taken part of and the work that you're doing right now, what are some things that may help to bring people together? Because there is this division in our country right now, not only politically, but when it comes to this, the implementation of some of these courses being used in schools. We've seen the TV reports on how school board meetings have become a little bit, I guess a little bit more hectic and stressful. So what is the research showing, or is there anything that's working that's helping bringing people together?
So I invite everyone to think about what will be our legacy. What stories will we tell about how we will create a more perfect union for all? I remember that one of my graduate school mentors, the late Dr. Nishi, born in LA, shared her own and her family's experience as a survivor of the Japanese internment camps. It's interesting, she actually wrote a telegram to President Roosevelt complaining about internment as undemocratic. I believe that Dr. Nishi shared these experiences and that of her family and other Japanese Americans who were imprisoned during the internment, not to cultivate anti-American feelings, but rather the opposite. I think telling these stories invites us to think critically about our history so that we can create a stronger and more just future anchored in freedom and liberation for all. I invite everyone to think about what stories you will tell, right? And how can they create empathy and understanding. So I think that part of that is reflecting on our own histories. And again, as I mentioned earlier, shifting and understanding other people's histories. And in that way, we can actually create unity and flexible solidarity, what Patricia Hill Collins calls flexible solidarity.
I see.
Where we love our families, but we love all families as well, right?
You bring up a great point. Dr. Lozano, you saw this happening when your district was implementing policy JBC, an equity policy in the school district. You saw a lot of folks from different perspectives on this voice their opinions, and these were some pretty heated school board meetings. So what was it that you were able to do to work with people from different perspectives to address this issue and try to bring some more understanding?
Thank you for bringing this topic up. I think it's a great question. As you mentioned, in May of 2021, our school board adopted policy JBC, Equity and Excellence for All Students. And really at the core of this policy was the board's commitment to ensure that we have systems in place in our district to address inequities within our educational system, right? There's a lot of work to do, specifically regarding certain populations and those that were brought up in the Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit, which is a landmark education case here in New Mexico. To answer your question, one of the actions that we took in collaboration with Superintendent Ramos was being transparent and sitting down with people that were genuinely concerned. As you mentioned, a lot was happening on social media, on a national level regarding CRT. And when we developed the regulation, which is the procedures that we're going to do to implement the policy, we made sure that we had people at the table that had doubts, that had questions, and so they could understand. And what I found was that we had a lot more in common and agreed on a lot of issues that we knew that our district needed to improve on. So with that, I think one of the things that we did as a district was to be transparent in the process of adopting this policy, but also listen to people because they have valid concerns and from their perspective, from their life experiences. So I think that's critical when trying to understand and give information.
Okay, we just have about under 2 minutes left in this conversation, but I'd like to hear from you both. New Mexico is in the process of implementing new social studies standards. How do you think these can affect education for all students in New Mexico? About 30 seconds each. Dr. Lopez?
Imagine if we included standards that helped us understand the histories of American Indians, of indigenous people in this state. Imagine if we included standards that helped us focus on power relations, on the cultural wealth. We might actually create a different future. So I hope that we can understand that the evidence is clear. These courses enhance student success, and they create loving and healthy communities.
Okay, Dr. Lozano.
So the standards are an essential component of what we do as educators. It was really necessary for the standards to be updated. A lot has happened since the last time the standards were updated. So just like in any other business, you have to update, you have to keep up with the times. And really what the standards do is really outlined a blueprint for what teachers are expected to teach in their classrooms. Now, how that delivered is really up to the local districts, and what resources they use, what materials they use. That's a local decision based on the needs of the community, because New Mexico is a diverse state. But for me, it was necessary to update the standards because of a lot of things have happened since the last time they were updated. I don't remember the exact date, but it was for sure more than 10 years ago.
Okay. Dr. Roberto Lozano and Dr. Nancy Lopez, thank you both for joining us for our panel discussion.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Regardless of the deep divisions in political views in the United States, there is some agreement about racism and discrimination in our country. A survey conducted earlier this year by the Pew Research Center shows that 74% of Americans say that racial and ethnic discrimination is a serious problem in the country. We leave you with that, and a big thank you to our guests and panelists for joining us for Issues and Answers, Education, and the Culture Wars.